Megan stood in front of the mirror, carefully straightening the chestnut curls that framed her soft, slightly thoughtful face. The eyes, usually sparkling and serene, today expressed slight concern. She was wearing the perfect dress, soft, cream color, emphasizing her thin waist and graceful figure. Smiling next to the mirror was her husband, Jason, a tall man with a strong build and an attractive smile. "Honey, you look amazing," he said softly, coming up from behind and putting his arm around her waist. "Is it true?" She smiled slightly, meeting his gaze with his reflection. "For some reason, it seems to me that I overdid it." "Did you overdo it?" He laughed. "You will be the most beautiful woman on this holiday. All my colleagues will simply burst with envy." "You're exaggerating," Megan sighed quietly, but Jason's smile calmed her down. Tonight was supposed to be a regular corporate event for Jason's company, but for some reason Megan had a strange feeling that something would change. While they were driving in the car, Jason talked about office news and gossip, and Megan looked out the window, watching the flickering lights of the city at night. "Are you listening to me, dear?" he asked, touching her knee. "Yes, yes, of course," she hastened to answer, returning her thoughts to the conversation. "You said that Mark was complaining again about the lack of staff, right?" "Exactly," he nodded, parking at the huge hall of the hotel where the event was taking place. "But let's forget about all this today and just have a good time." Megan took his arm, entering the hall, which was already filled with music, laughter, and conversations of dozens of people. Familiar faces greeted them, and Megan soon relaxed, engaging in lively conversations with her husband's colleagues and their spouses. And then, in the midst of the evening, Megan suddenly heard a familiar voice behind her. "It can't be, Megan." She turned around and froze, as if struck by an electric shock. In front of her stood a tall, slender man with expressive gray eyes and light stubble on his face, which gave him a special charm. It was Luke, her first big love, the same guy she was inseparable from in college. "Luke." Megan's voice sounded almost like a whisper. "Lord, I didn't even know you were back in town. I didn't even think that I would come back." Luke smiled, warmly and slightly thoughtfully. "I received an offer that I couldn't refuse. Now, I've been here again for 3 months." Megan felt her heart begin to beat faster. She knew Jason was somewhere nearby, but at that moment it didn't matter at all. 3 months, and how do you like it? "It was strange at first," Luke shrugged, "but then I got used to it. Although, I must admit, I did not expect to meet you here, in such an environment. Is it really your husband who works at the company?" "Yes, Jason. We've been married for 3 years now." Megan's voice sounded even, but everything was seething inside. 3 years. Luke repeated thoughtfully, carefully examining her face. "You look like you're happy." "It is," she answered quickly, feeling her cheeks begin to turn red. "I'm glad for you," Luke said with a smile, but his look said something completely different. "And you, married, children?" she asked, trying to change the subject. "No," Luke shook his head softly, his smile becoming a little sad. "I haven't found one yet. It seems like I missed my destiny at some point." They both fell silent, and there was an awkward pause, which Luke hastened to break. "Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. It's just nice to see you again." "Me too," Megan answered quietly, sincerely feeling every word. It was at that moment that Jason appeared nearby. "Honey, I lost you." He looked at Luke, then at Megan. "Oh, it seems you have already met." "We've known each other for a long time," Luke smiled softly, extending his hand. "Luke Mitchell, Megan and I went to college together." "Jason Harrison," the husband nodded, shaking his hand. "Nice to meet you." Mutually, Luke answered briefly, turning his gaze back to Megan. After a short pause, Jason suggested, "Maybe we can have a glass of wine." "Thank you, but I have to go." Luke quickly refused, stepping back. "See you later." As he disappeared into the crowd, Jason looked closely at his wife. "Is something wrong?" "No," Megan sighed, trying to smile. "It's just so strange to see him again after so many years." Jason touched her shoulder softly. "Are you sure?" "Of course, honey." She took his hand, trying to look calm. It's simply amazing how life sometimes brings back old acquaintances to us. But in fact, Megan already felt something long forgotten, alarming and forbidden awakening inside. She understood that this meeting would not end just like that and would become the beginning of a completely new chapter in her life, and only she can decide which one. Megan woke up in the middle of the night from a tense, anxious feeling that seemed to creep up on her out of the darkness. She sat up in bed and tried to understand what had woken her up. There were no loud sounds, no noise in the house. Jason slept nearby, breathing peacefully, and his presence usually gave her a feeling of security. But that night, memories that she had long tried to hide deep in the past suddenly surfaced in her mind. She quietly got out of bed and, putting on a light robe, went into the living room. There, near the window, breaking through the translucent curtains, the moonlight softly illuminated the room, giving it a fabulous look. Megan sank onto the sofa, hugging her knees with her hands, and tried to calm down. Suddenly, the image of a young girl with flowing brown hair, thoughtful eyes, full of hope, and not yet knowing the bitterness of disappointment surfaced in her memory. It was herself, only many years ago, when she was barely 19, when everything in life seemed possible, and her heart was beating just at the thought of the future. And next to her is him, Luke. A tall, slightly awkward young man who always looked at her as if the whole world for him was concentrated only in her smile. They met in one of the university buildings, where introductory lectures were held for freshmen. Megan came there unsure, full of fear that she would not cope with her new responsibilities and role as an independent student. But Luke then unexpectedly winked at her from the next row when the lecturer accidentally said her name while checking the list. She became embarrassed and hid her gaze, but he only smiled wider, making it clear that it was a friendly greeting and not ridicule. Megan often recalled how it all began. A small, stupid detail, a fragment of time when the lecturer called her to the board, and she was afraid of making a mistake in her answer. But to her surprise, Luke then stood up and, as if imperceptibly prompting, helped her with gestures. The whole course noticed this, but no one laughed. Perhaps everyone understood what it was like to be a confused freshman. After the lecture ended, she walked up to Luke, ready to thank him. "Hello," Megan said then, feeling how everything inside her froze with excitement. "Thank you for helping there." "Oh, it's nothing," Luke smiled, leaning the back of his head on the wall of the corridor. "I didn't want you to lose points at the very beginning." They both laughed, and then, somehow naturally, they began to walk together along the long corridor. And it seemed that this corridor would guide them all their lives. It stretched endlessly, and their conversation gradually moved from studies to personal matters, then to dreams of the future. And at that very moment, it was as if a thread had formed between them, thin, almost imperceptible, but even then holding their hearts together. Megan remembered how a week later they were preparing for a seminar together, sitting in the library. Quiet room, flickering fluorescent lamps, muffled voices. She talked a lot about her fears and doubts, and Luke listened to her so carefully, as if he was absorbing every word. In response, he talked about how he wanted to become an engineer, design bridges that would connect banks and help people cross rivers and canyons. He described with delight how one day he would create something great that would become a symbol of progress. "Imagine," Luke said in a quiet voice, so as not to disturb the library visitors, "thousands of people every day will drive across the bridges that we designed. Some will go to work, some will go to family, and some will go on vacation. But they won't even think that once a young guy dreamed of connecting the shores." Megan looked at him with admiration and thought, how wonderful it is when a person believes so much in what he does. Then she herself felt that she could achieve a lot. She wanted to become a journalist covering important social issues, travel, and find unique stories about people who make the world a better place. Soon they could no longer imagine days without each other. Calls in the morning to wish you a good day, meetings after classes, even for a few minutes, just to hug and feel that there is someone close to you. And every time their eyes met, Megan felt a wave of warmth rise in her chest. Young feelings were pure and sincere, like the first snow covering the earth, but melting at any touch. One day, after another evening lecture, They decided to take a walk along the embankment. It was the end of autumn. The air had already become cool, and a light fog hung over the river. Luke insisted that they go to a small cafe nearby. They sold hot chocolate desserts, which, according to him, everyone went crazy for. Megan was happy to warm up and agreed. When they entered, the waitress greeted them with a smile and then led them to a table by the window. Luke took off his scarf, hung it carefully on the back of his chair, and helped Megan take off her jacket. This gesture, his attention to detail, made her smile every time. Such gentlemanly, albeit a little old-fashioned care. They ordered cocoa with marshmallows and cakes, and when the aromatic drink was brought, Luke proposed a toast. "For us," he said, lightly knocking his cup against hers as if it were morning champagne. "May all the roads of this world one day lead us to what we dream of." They drank this sweet drink, looked at each other, and the whole outside world seemed to disappear somewhere. Since then, this cafe became their little place where they returned when they needed to discuss something important or just be alone together. Megan took a deep breath, sitting now, at night, on the sofa in the living room. Images of carefree youth, filled with hope and joy, appeared before my eyes. And among these memories, the words that Luke spoke to her on their secret bench on campus under a large plane tree became increasingly vivid. "Do you know why I want to build bridges? Because one person once told me that with true love you can overcome any distance. But I think that sometimes the distance between two hearts is not so much physical as it is emotional. A bridge is not always needed only across a river, it is also needed between people." Then she smiled, not fully understanding the depth of his thoughts. It seemed to her that everything was so wonderful with them that there were and could not be any obstacles. And the word parting itself sounded somehow alien. They were confident that they could do anything. The memories continued, how they went to parties, danced to loud music, holding hands, running away from the stuffy hall to take a breath of night air. How Luke secretly smuggled a guitar into the dorm to surprise her and sing a song he wrote himself. How they ran away from their classes to go out of town, sit on the shore of the lake and discuss every turn of the future. But over time, the first cracks appeared. At the end of her sophomore year, Megan got an internship at a well-known newspaper. This was a huge opportunity for her. At the same time, Luke won a grant to study in another state, where he could realize his potential as an engineer. At first, they rejoiced at each other's successes, made plans to see each other on weekends, and corresponded when they couldn't meet. But life began to make its own changes. Luke had little free time due to constant projects and seminars where he worked on drawings for several days at a time. Megan plunged headlong into journalistic practice, running to interviews, trying to meet the expectations of editors who already looked at her with disdain, considering her a newcomer. They began to call each other less and less often. Both were exhausted and could not share their feelings with each other, hiding fatigue and the fear of losing each other under the yoke of their own ambitions and desires. And then one day, after a long separation, they met in their cafe. It was a gray, rainy day. Lightning was still flashing outside the windows, and inside Megan felt that some kind of invisible wall had already grown between them. She expected that it would be enough to just see Luke, hug him, and everything would be as before. But he was gloomy, tense, and hardly smiled. "I can't deceive myself anymore." Luke exhaled heavily after a long pause, twirling a cup of unfinished cocoa in his hands. "Our paths diverge. You see, right?" "No." Megan whispered, feeling like everything was breaking inside. "Don't say that." "It hurts me too," he continued. "But we meet once a month, if not less often, and all these conversations on the phone are not life. You're tired in the evening, so am I. We can't help each other, we're just loading. We could find a way." Megan began, but Luke shook his head sharply. "Megan, I know that we love each other. It's just, sometimes life divides people. Maybe this is temporary, or maybe." He didn't finish, but Megan already understood everything. They sat in silence for a long time, each immersed in their own thoughts, while the rain pattered outside the window. And when they left the cafe, Luke straightened the collar of his coat, looked into her eyes, wet from rain and tears, and said, "Goodbye. If our paths ever cross again, I will be glad that fate gave us a second chance." He gently kissed her forehead and left, disappearing into the gray city. At first, Megan rushed through the streets, trying to catch up with him, but then she realized that it was pointless. Luke was right. Their paths diverged at the moment when they both chose independent paths to their goals. They wrote to each other for a long time, called each other, but the conversations became more and more tense. Soon the connection was completely interrupted. Now, sitting in the living room, Megan remembered all this so clearly, as if it all happened just yesterday. My heart sank with bitterness, but at the same time with sweet nostalgia. In these memories there was beauty and boundless love, and those very dreams that seemed to be already lost. And only now, when Luke appeared in her life again, albeit by accident, did Megan realize that she had never gotten rid of the feeling of loss. She always kept inside something like an unclosed door in the past, behind which she hid her best, but at the same time her most painful memories. She tried to get up and pour herself a glass of water to stop the trembling in her hands. But approaching the kitchen table, she saw her reflection in a small mirror hanging on the wall. Her gaze was full of doubt and anxiety. At that moment, a realization came to her. What if I had acted differently then? What if we hadn't given up? Of course, life does not know the subjunctive mood, and all these ifs no longer make sense. But what remained undeniable was that meeting Luke at a corporate party stirred up a storm of feelings in her that she had so carefully buried for so long. And perhaps now they will not allow her to remain the same, a loving wife, confident in the future, calm and happy. "Damn," Megan whispered, taking a sip of water. "Why did fate bring us together again?" She pictured Jason's face. He is not to blame for anything and sincerely loves her. He did a lot for her and was a support in difficult moments. With him, she felt stability and care, but sometimes she was struck by the thought that their relationship lacked some spark, that same reckless impulse that was in her youth. Maybe it's part of adult life, losing the ability to dream and be carefree and happy. Or maybe not, she thought, feeling the warm memory of past passions stirring in her chest again. And at that moment, it seemed to her that she was standing on the edge of an abyss. On one side of the abyss is her calm family life with Jason, predictable but reliable. On the other, a fleeting but very intense storm of feelings associated with Luke. And although no one was forcing her to make a decision right now, the very existence of the choice was already causing her to panic. That night passed with almost no sleep. Megan couldn't bring herself to go back to the bedroom and lie next to her husband, pretending that everything was fine. She spent the rest of the dark hours turning over scenes from the past one after another in her head, like an old movie that she had already seen 1,000 times, but continued to watch, hoping for a different ending. But the end remained the same. Luke went into the fog, and she was left with a feeling of emptiness. And now, many years later, this empty hall seemed to be illuminated by a spotlight again, and the heroes returned to the stage, ready for a new act. Am I afraid of this? Megan asked herself. Yes, I'm afraid, but at the same time, a strange excitement ignites within me. Maybe there is still an opportunity to solve this long-standing mystery, to look the past straight in the eye. Or maybe I'm just following the path of self-destruction, risking losing what I have. Morning came, and outside the window, the sounds of the awakening city began to be heard. Somewhere in the distance, the first cars began to hum, and the voices of hurrying people were heard. Megan stood up, feeling aches all over her body from sitting in one position for so long. She went into the bathroom, washed her face with cold water, trying to drive away the remnants of sleep and mental turmoil. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who seemed to have overcome a storm of emotions over the past few hours. Footsteps were heard behind him. It was Jason, who woke up and looked into the bathroom. "Good morning." His voice was slightly sleepy. "Have you been up for a long time?" "Yes, I couldn't sleep," Megan answered, trying to smile. "Did something happen?" He came closer and put his hand on her shoulder. "Maybe something is bothering you." She thought for a moment, wondering if she needed to tell everything right now. No, she wasn't ready for it yet. No, she tried to answer calmly. She was probably just nervous because of last night and the large number of people. Jason apparently believed her words or did not want to go into details. He nodded and offered to make coffee. When he went into the kitchen, Megan lingered a moment longer in the bathroom, looking at her reflection. She understood that she had to somehow understand herself. First of all, she needs to understand exactly what she is looking for and what her soul is drawn to. After all, memories of first love are not just pleasant pictures of the past. This is a part of her that has not disappeared anywhere and suddenly came to life as soon as Luke appeared again. However, memories are a dangerous thing. They can revive not only joy, but also pain. They can throw up illusions and lead down the wrong path. And Megan felt it. However, she could no longer ignore the quiet whispering inside her. What if? What if this is your chance? With this question, Megan left the bathroom, deciding to hide her worries and doubts behind a smile, at least for a while. After all, there was a new day ahead, in which she had to live with the fact that her past had returned, loudly reminding itself, like an unforgettable voice from her youth, and she could no longer pretend that she didn't hear it. Several days have passed since that sleepless night when memories flooded Megan with such force that she could not find peace. She was sure that her emotions would subside a little and she would be able to regain her usual balance, but suddenly in the morning her phone rang. An unfamiliar number, and for some reason my heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" Megan answered carefully. "Hello, Megan. This is Luke." The voice on the other end sounded so familiar that it took her breath away. Megan tried to remain calm, even though her heart was beating desperately in her chest. "Luke, hi. I didn't expect to hear from you." "Yes, I'm sorry for bothering you so unexpectedly." His voice sounded warm and a little hesitant. "I thought we should talk. Ever since we met that evening, I keep thinking about you, and I think there's something we need to talk about." "What exactly?" Megan asked, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "Just talk about the past, about how our lives turned out. I think we have some unfinished conversations. Shall we go for coffee?" Megan knew that she should have refused immediately, come up with any reason to avoid this meeting. But instead, she, surprising herself, answered, "Fine, let's meet." They agreed to meet in a small cafe in the city center, where Megan arrived earlier to have time to calm her nerves. Sitting at a table by the window, she nervously fingered her napkin, trying to convince herself that this meeting meant absolutely nothing. Just two adults talking about the past. But her inner voice said something completely different. When the cafe door opened and Luke walked inside, Megan's heart began to beat faster again. He smiled at her, took off his sunglasses, and walked over to the table. "Hello again," he said softly, sitting down opposite. "Hi," Megan replied, trying to appear calm. They ordered coffee and desserts, after which there was a short pause filled with slight awkwardness. "You look great," Luke finally said, breaking the silence. "Thank you, you too," Megan replied, blushing slightly. He chuckled and shook his head thoughtfully. "You know, I often thought about what happened between us then. I felt like I was doing the right thing by letting you go. But now, after so many years, I'm no longer sure." "Why are you saying this now?" Megan asked, looking at him carefully. "Because when I saw you again, I realized that my feelings had not disappeared anywhere. They were just waiting for their moment." "Luke," Megan shook her head, feeling her voice shake. "I'm married, and—" "I know," he interrupted her, raising his hand slightly. "And believe me, I don't want to ruin your life. Let's just chat like old friends for now." "Fine." Megan took a deep breath, feeling both relieved and slightly disappointed. "Okay," she agreed, trying to smile. "Just friends." Their conversation gradually became calmer. They began to talk about the past, about the funny and touching moments of their youth together. It was as if time had turned back, and Megan soon noticed that the tension had disappeared, and she was already laughing at the stories Luke told. After that meeting, they began to see each other more and more often. Coffee once a week, then twice, and soon regular correspondence on social networks. Each time, Megan convinced herself that this was just a conversation between two old friends. But somewhere deep inside, she understood that the feelings that once connected them were returning at an alarming rate. One evening, when they were again sitting at a table in the same cafe, Luke suddenly looked at her seriously. "Megan, I have to ask you something." His voice sounded a little tense. "Of course, ask," she answered with a smile, although her heart was beating faster. "Are you happy?" His gaze pierced her right through, as if trying to look into her very soul. Megan froze, feeling all her confidence and calm disappear instantly. "Of course, I'm happy," she whispered. "Are you sure?" Luke asked without looking away. She looked away and swallowed nervously. "Yes, Luke, I'm happy," she repeated, but her voice no longer sounded so confident. He sighed and smiled slightly. "Sorry if I offended you. It's just that when I look at you, I see doubt in your eyes." "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "Sometimes I feel like I've lost something important." "Something important or someone important," he clarified quietly. Megan did not answer. She just looked at him with such an expression that everything became clear to him without words. "I feel it too," Luke said, his voice hoarse and sincere. "But I understand your situation. I just want you to know that I'm here if you ever need to talk or just be with someone who understands you." Megan nodded slightly, trying to suppress the tears that suddenly began to well up in her throat. "Thank you, Luke. This means a lot to me." They ended the evening quietly and thoughtfully. When Megan returned home, she realized that her life had become much more difficult. Every day she fought with herself, trying to convince her heart that Luke was just a friend and their meetings meant nothing. But every day it became more and more difficult. And although she understood that she was playing with fire, it was increasingly difficult for her to restrain herself from throwing herself headlong into this fire. Now there were two roads in her life, and each of them led her to the inevitable loss, either of her past or her present. But so far she could not make a choice and continued to live in the illusion that everything was under control. Almost a whole week had passed since the last meeting with Luke, but Megan could not get his words, looks, intonations out of her head. She constantly caught herself thinking that she was waiting for a new call or message so that she could see him again, hear his voice. An internal conflict was brewing in her heart, which gradually destroyed her calm. Another Saturday evening, she decided to take a walk to clear her thoughts a little. She was walking down the street when her phone vibrated in her coat pocket. Megan glanced at the screen and instantly felt her heart pounding. It was Luke again. "Hi," she tried to sound calm. "Hello," Luke's quiet but firm voice instantly awakened all the hidden excitement in her. "I know it's a little late, but I need to talk to you. Could you meet?" Megan took a deep breath and answered without thinking. "Of course, just tell me where." They agreed to meet in a quiet park not far from her home. Megan arrived first and sat on a bench near the lake, looking at the moonlight playing on the surface of the water. The air was cool but refreshing, allowing at least for a while to forget about the storm raging in my soul. A few minutes later, footsteps were heard, and Luke sat down next to him, wrapped in a warm coat. He was silent for a few moments before turning and looking into her eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to come." His voice was full of gratitude and tenderness. "I was afraid that you would refuse." "Why did you think that?" Megan asked, avoiding his gaze and trying to control her own breathing. "Because I'm going to say something that you might not like." Luke took a deep breath, as if preparing to jump into icy water. "Speak," she whispered, barely audible. "I still love you, Megan." "I love you like I've never loved anyone else," he said decisively and quietly, as if he was afraid that the words would frighten him. These words echoed in her heart, sharp and unexpected. Megan instantly felt a rush of blood to her cheeks and heard a ringing in her ears. "Luke," she began in a trembling voice, "do you understand what you're saying?" "I understand, and I understand how difficult it is. But I can't hide my feelings anymore. Since I saw you again, I can't think of anything else." He spoke passionately and confidently, "and even if you say it's impossible, I still had to say it." Megan closed her eyes, trying to cope with the surging storm of emotions. I don't know what to answer, she said quietly, finally opening her eyes and looking at him with painful confusion. Just tell me how you feel. Tell me honestly. He leaned slightly towards her, and Megan felt the light aroma of his perfume, which so vividly reminded her of past times. I married Luke. I have to think about my husband. Her voice trembled when she said this out loud. I know that, and I respect your choice. But tell me the truth. Are you happy now? Really happy? She couldn't bring herself to lie. Deep down, she knew the answer. Her eyes filled with tears that she could barely hold back. I don't know, Luke, she answered almost in a whisper. I'm used to thinking that I'm happy, that I have everything I need to be happy. Stability, a caring husband, a home. But after meeting you, I seem to begin to lose confidence in this. He carefully took her hand in his, and this touch was so familiar, as if the years of separation had simply disappeared. Megan, sometimes we confuse habit and comfort with real happiness. I don't want to ruin your life. I just want to be honest with myself and with you. You have always been my one and only true love, and I am not going to hide it. I'm scared, Luke, Megan said, feeling a tear roll down her cheek. I'm afraid that if I take a step towards you, I'll destroy everything I have now. Sometimes destroying the old is the only path to something real, Luke answered, his gaze burning with determination. But the decision is always yours. They sat in silence for a long time, listening only to the splashing of water and the sounds of the night. Megan felt on the verge of an abyss, not knowing what to do. A real war raged in her soul between duty and heart. Let me be there, Luke finally said. Even if just as a friend, don't drive me away. I can't drive you away, she answered quietly. You are too important to me to lose you again. These words sounded almost like a confession to both of them. The weight of inexpressible feelings, emotions, and forbidden desires hung in the air. Megan returned home in complete confusion. Jason was already asleep, and she lay quietly next to him, trying to find the usual peace, but restless thoughts and feelings kept her from falling asleep. She realized that Luke's confession changed everything. Now she couldn't just pretend like nothing had happened. Now she was forced to admit to herself that her life was missing exactly what Luke was able to give her: passion, depth of feelings, and true, undying love. She stared into the darkness, pondering every word Luke spoke, and each time her heart began to beat faster. Now she clearly understood that her quiet life with Jason was only comfortable and predictable, but devoid of real fire, real intimacy. Luke brought her back to herself, to that girl who knew how to feel deeply and desperately. When dawn broke, Megan realized that her life was divided into before and after Luke's confession. Now every day became a test, because she had to choose between calm and passion, between the past and the future, between duty and desire. After Luke's confession, Megan's life became a constant stream of doubts and sleepless nights. Every conversation with his husband seemed strained and tense, as if Jason sensed something was wrong but didn't dare ask directly. At the same time, every message from Luke caused her to panic and worry, which she could no longer control. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, her phone rang again. Seeing Luke's name on the screen, Megan felt the blood rush to her cheeks. "Hello," her voice sounded uncertain. "Megan, I know that you are tired of our controversial meetings and conversations." Luke's voice sounded confident and gentle at the same time. "I want to see you alone, without people, without coffee shops and restaurants. Just you and me. Give me one evening. Please." Megan's heart was beating so hard that she was afraid he would hear it through the phone. "Okay," she breathed, not believing herself. "Where and when?" "I'll rent a hotel room outside the city." "It's calm there, no one will know," Luke said calmly and confidently. "I promise, no obligations. Let's just talk." "Okay," she repeated, feeling how everything inside was trembling with anticipation and fear of her own consent. The day of the meeting arrived. Megan had been nervous and distracted all day, trying to hide it from Jason. When her husband went to meet friends, she quickly got ready. Her heart beat faster with every kilometer that brought her closer to the meeting place. The hotel turned out to be quiet and cozy, hidden among the trees on the outskirts of the city. When she knocked on the door, she panicked and was ready to run away, but the door immediately opened. Luke stood in front of her, slightly worried, but his eyes glowed with warmth and tenderness. "Come in," he said quietly, and Megan went inside. The room was spacious and beautifully decorated. Luke ordered wine and light snacks, which were already waiting for them on the table near the window. They sat for a while, talking about neutral things, work, the weather, trying to avoid the tension in the air. But Megan felt that a turning point would inevitably come in their communication. Finally, Luke, as if reading her thoughts, interrupted her story. "Megan, stop hiding from what we both feel," he said firmly, looking straight into her eyes. "I know you're not here just to talk. Tell me honestly, why did you come?" Megan was silent for a few seconds, then quietly answered, "Because I can't fight myself anymore." These words became a signal for Luke, and he slowly approached her, stopping only a few centimeters away. He looked into her eyes, as if looking for confirmation of her words. "I've been waiting for this moment for so long," he whispered, barely touching her hand. Megan felt her entire skin covered in goosebumps from his touch. She looked up, their eyes met, and at that moment she realized that all her attempts to resist were doomed. Luke leaned in slowly, and Megan felt a light breath on her lips. Her heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it was about to burst out. Their lips met softly, carefully, as if both were afraid that this was just a dream that could be dispelled by any sudden movement. But then the kiss deepened, and Megan felt something long forgotten, an incredibly strong awakening within her. They kissed for a long time, gradually losing the sense of time. This kiss was both tender and passionate, full of despair and hope. Luke carefully pressed her to him, as if afraid to frighten away this moment, and Megan, forgetting about everything in the world, completely surrendered to her feelings. When the kiss ended, they slowly pulled away, but Luke did not let go of her, holding her hands tightly. "Megan, I love you," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I never stopped loving you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she couldn't hold back her sobs. "Luke, I love you too, but this is wrong. I'm married, and this is wrong." "Sometimes the right things happen at the wrong time," he answered quietly, stroking her cheek. "I understand the complexity of the situation, but I simply could not remain silent any longer." Megan felt tears running down her cheeks, but she didn't try to stop them. She pressed herself closer to him, wanting this moment to last forever, for everything around to disappear and only the two of them to remain. "What should we do now?" she whispered, finally pulling back slightly to look into his eyes. "I don't know," Luke admitted, running his finger over her cheek, wiping away a tear. "But we can't pretend like nothing happened. I can't lose you again." Megan was silent, unable to find the right words. She knew that from that moment her life would change forever, and there was no turning back. "Let me be there," Luke said again, his gaze full of determination. "No matter what happens next, I want to be a part of your life." "I don't know how to live on now," she whispered, feeling emotions covering her head again. "Together we'll figure it out," Luke said confidently, carefully lifting her face by the chin to look into her eyes. "Just trust me." Megan nodded slowly, feeling the last barrier inside her crumble. Now she realized that she had stepped over the line, which forever divided her life into before and after. And although she understood that there was a lot of pain, doubt, and uncertainty ahead, at that moment she was overcome only by a feeling of incredible liberation and passion that she had forgotten about for so long. The meeting with Luke left an indelible mark on Megan's soul. Returning home late at night, she quietly crept into the bedroom, trying not to wake her husband. Jason slept peacefully, unaware of the storm that was unfolding in her heart. Standing by the bed, she watched him and felt a sharp, painful feeling of guilt rising in her chest. The next few days turned into real torture. She avoided meeting Jason's gaze and answered his questions briefly and evasively, which made her husband become increasingly concerned. "Megan, what's going on?" he asked one evening, carefully closing the bedroom door and looking anxiously into her eyes. You have become so strange, silent. Did something happen? She shuddered at his words and barely found the strength to answer. I'm just tired from work. Nothing serious. Jason looked at her carefully, but then simply nodded and hugged her. Okay, honey, just remember that I'm here if you need anything. These words only increased her torment. When her husband left the room, she covered her face with her hands, barely holding back her tears. What have I done? What am I doing? She repeated to herself, feeling how conflicting feelings were tearing her apart from the inside. Despite her internal struggle, calls and messages from Luke continued. She tried to ignore them, delete his number, and erase his correspondence history, but every time she stopped at the last moment. She was drawn to him like a magnet, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to resist. One evening Luke called again. Megan was home alone, and after a short hesitation, she finally answered. Luke, I can't do this anymore, she began immediately, trying not to let him get a word in. This is wrong. I have to stop communicating with you. Megan, Luke interrupted her calmly. We both know that this is impossible. I feel the same as you, and I see it in your eyes. You can lie to your husband, but not to me, and not to myself. These words rang true, from which it was impossible to hide. She felt tears welling up in her eyes again. You have no idea how difficult this is, she whispered, barely keeping her voice in check. Every time I look at Jason, I feel like a traitor. He loves me, trusts me, and I understand, Luke answered quietly. But my feelings for you are also real. I'm not going to hurt you or him. But don't you deserve real happiness? I don't know what's right, Megan answered, her voice shaking. Everything has become so confusing. Just meet me again. Let's talk calmly, without pressure. If after this you decide that you don't want to see me, I promise that I will disappear from your life forever. She knew she should have refused, but instead she agreed again. It seemed that her will was completely paralyzed by feelings that captured her more and more every day. The next meeting took place in a small hotel outside the city. There, in a cozy, subdued atmosphere, they sat opposite each other again. But this time Megan could not stand the tension and burst into tears right in front of Luke. What's happening to me? She asked through tears. Why can't I just stop? Luke gently took her hands, stroking her trembling fingers with his fingertips. Because your heart knows the truth, Megan. It knows what you really want. You can try to convince yourself otherwise, but your feelings cannot be fooled. But I destroy everything around me, she said without raising her eyes. I'm afraid of who I'm becoming. You don't destroy. You're just trying to figure out what you really want, Luke said softly, gently taking her face in his hands and forcing her to look into his eyes. Allow yourself to be honest at least for a moment. How do you feel about me? I love you, Luke, she whispered, barely audible, feeling both relieved and guilty at her words. This confession hung between them, filling the entire space of the room. Luke slowly approached, and this time the kiss was not just tender, it had all the passion, all the desperation and pain of long years of separation. Megan kissed back, forgetting about everything except this moment when her heart finally got what it wanted for so long. But after a minute, she abruptly pulled away. No, we can't do this, she said firmly, although her heart was beating desperately. This is too much. Luke looked at her silently, eyes full of understanding and patience meeting her frightened gaze. I'll wait as long as necessary, he said calmly. You have to sort yourself out, I understand. I'll wait. Megan quickly left, feeling that if she stayed even a minute longer, she would not be able to leave. Returning home, she felt real despair for the first time in a long time. Jason was breathing quietly in the bedroom, deep in sleep. Megan lay down next to her and, looking at the ceiling, felt a sharp pain in her chest. Forgive me, she whispered barely audibly, knowing that her husband would no longer hear her. That night, for the first time, she realized that she was balancing on the edge, which was about to break, taking with it everything that she considered reliable and stable. She loved Luke, but she also understood that her feelings for him cost her peace of mind and faith in herself. She desperately wanted to find a way out, but felt that any path led to loss. either a loved one from the past or a faithful husband to whom she promised eternity. Several weeks have passed since Megan took a step beyond which there was no turning back. Her feelings for Luke grew into a real obsession. She constantly thought about him, reminiscing about their meetings and kisses. Every glance of Jason, every affectionate gesture of his evoked a painful feeling of guilt in her, but at the same time she could not refuse to meet with Luke, since only next to him she felt alive again. Their relationship has long ceased to be just friendly meetings. Now every date was accompanied by a painful struggle between duty and desire, but Luke was irresistible, and she knew that she was losing control of herself. One evening Luke called her again. "I can't take it anymore, Megan." His voice sounded tense and passionate at the same time. "I need to see you." "When?" she asked, unable to fight her own desire. "Tonight. I rented a room again, another hotel. No one would find us there. Please come." Megan agreed without hesitation. Her heart was beating wildly in her chest. She felt that this evening would be a turning point, after which everything would change completely. When she arrived at the hotel, Luke was already waiting for her at the door of the room. His gaze, filled with burning passion, made her breath hitch. He pulled her towards him, barely closing the door behind him. "I can't wait any longer," he whispered and kissed her as deeply and passionately as ever before. Megan gave herself completely to his kiss, feeling the whole world dissolve around them. She didn't think about anything else except being in his arms. Luke carefully led her into the room, without taking his lips off hers. Megan felt his every touch, every movement of his fingers on her body made her tremble with pleasure and anticipation. "Are you sure you want this?" Luke asked, breaking the kiss and looking into her eyes. "Yes," she breathed, and this short word sounded with such determination that any doubts, if there were any, disappeared completely. He carefully removed her dress, and when his palms touched her skin, Megan felt a shiver run through her body. His touch was both gentle and confident, full of desire and respect. Luke seemed to know her better than she knew herself. They spent a night together filled with passion and tenderness, and with every touch Megan felt like Luke was discovering in her the woman whose existence she had long forgotten. Their intimacy was not just physical, it was imbued with deep feelings, long years of waiting and lost love, which has now returned with a vengeance. As the first rays of sunlight penetrated the curtains, Megan woke up in Luke's arms. He didn't sleep, just looked at her with a soft smile. "You are beautiful," he whispered, lightly touching her cheek. She felt her cheeks flush and turned away, ashamed of her weakness. "What are you thinking now?" Luke asked, feeling her tension. "I think that now my life has become unbearably difficult," she answered sadly. "I no longer understand who I am or what I'm doing." "You just follow your heart," he said calmly, holding her close to him. "I don't regret anything, and neither should you." But Megan couldn't shake the guilt. She knew that she was doing wrong to Jason, who did not suspect anything and continued to sincerely love her. When she returned home, every glance of her husband seemed accusatory, every smile hurt her. Jason, noticing her condition, became more and more caring, trying to understand what was happening to her. But Megan could not explain anything, and this only aggravated her suffering. With each new day, her relationship with Luke became more desperate and passionate. They met secretly, hiding from the eyes of acquaintances and friends, and each of their meetings brought her both happiness and pain. One evening, Luke, hugging her after another meeting, quietly said, "We have to decide what to do next. This can't go on any longer." "I know," she answered in a trembling voice, "but I don't know what to do." "Just be with me," his voice sounded almost pleading. "We will overcome everything together. I promise I won't leave you." She was silent, realizing that she was facing the most difficult decision of her life. Her heart had already made its choice, but her mind desperately resisted. Returning home after this meeting, Megan realized that the situation was completely out of control. Now, every day she was torn by internal contradictions, and she understood that she would soon have to make a choice that would change not only her life, but also the lives of everyone who was dear to her. Every day it became more and more difficult for Megan to hide what was happening from Jason. Her thoughts were filled with memories of Luke, every moment spent together, every touch of his. Immersed in these thoughts, she often did not notice how she fell out of reality, becoming absent-minded and detached. Jason was an observant husband. He was used to Megan always being attentive and caring, but now she seemed to be slipping away, moving further and further away from him every day. One morning, sitting at breakfast, he finally couldn't stand it and asked, "Megan, are you even here? I've been asking you a question for a minute now, and it's like you're in another world." She shuddered, looking up at him with a confused look. "Sorry, I was lost in thought. What were you asking?" "I asked if we would go to your parents this weekend. We have long promised to visit them." "Yes, of course," she said quickly and looked away again. Jason looked at her silently for a few moments, then sighed and asked quietly, "What's happening to you? You have become so distant, detached. Did something happen?" He looked so genuinely concerned that Megan felt a lump of guilt rise in her throat. "I'm just tired," she said quietly, having difficulty finding words. "Sorry, there's a lot of stress at work." He looked at her carefully again, as if trying to look into her soul. "If something is wrong, you know you can tell me." "Of course," she whispered, feeling disgusted at the lie she had to tell over and over again. Jason nodded, although he clearly didn't believe her words. The tension between them became palpable, like a wall that had grown in just a few days. The situation worsened every day. Megan began to leave home more and more often, hiding behind work meetings and visits to friends. Jason couldn't help but notice that his wife began to avoid his presence, as if she were tormented by guilt or shame. One evening, Megan returned home later than usual, tired and stressed. Jason sat in the living room, his eyes glued to the door, waiting for her to return. "Are you late again?" he asked without reproach, but with obvious tension in his voice. "Yes, I had to stay late at work," she answered quietly, avoiding his gaze. Jason sighed heavily, stood up, and slowly walked towards her. "Megan, I'm not blind," he said firmly and a little sadly. "I see that you are hiding something. You've never left without an explanation before. You've never been so distant. Can you at least tell me what's wrong?" She felt her heart clench painfully at his words. Two feelings fought within her, the desire to tell the truth and the fear of the consequences. "It's just a difficult period at work," she said quietly, feeling how ridiculous and unconvincing it sounded. Jason shook his head and took a step back. "Okay, Megan, if you don't want to tell the truth now, I'll wait. But keep in mind, I'm not blind or stupid. I feel like you're hiding something. And when you're ready to tell, I'll listen." With these words, he left the room, leaving her alone with confusion and a feeling of even greater guilt. From that day on, tension in the family only intensified. Jason didn't say it directly, but Megan sensed that he was beginning to suspect something more serious than just fatigue. He started calling her more often, asking where she was going and when she would return. Sometimes he even came to pick her up at work, as if trying to make sure she wasn't cheating. She realized that she was losing control of the situation. Her relationship with Luke became more and more open, the meetings more and more risky. And although the feeling of guilt before her husband tore her heart, she was unable to refuse meetings with Luke. It had been several weeks since Megan first felt the inexplicable tension in the air when meeting with Luke. Their secret connection grew stronger, transforming from a whirlwind romance into something more complex and intricate. Her mind was increasingly clouded with doubts. Who is he to her, and who is she to him? Where does this relationship lead? And most importantly, what consequences will there be for her family? She noticed that Luke began to behave strangely. He received calls that he interrupted mid-sentence when she appeared. Sometimes he left their rented rooms for a long time. Sometimes he left with hidden anxiety in his eyes and returned with a tense face. Megan tried to ask what was wrong with him, but he only briefly waved her off. And when she insisted, he, on the contrary, tried to avoid answering, offering to do something pleasant, just to divert her attention to romance and passion. However, not only her suspicions grew, but also her anxiety. One evening, when they were once again secluded in a small house on the outskirts of the city, rented specifically for secret meetings, Megan noticed folders with documents lying on Luke's table. One of them had something printed on it about an investment project. She saw only snippets of names: Dolomex Corp., contract, obligations, and urgency. When Megan, thinking that these were work papers, out of habit decided to help and pick up the folder to put it aside, Luke instantly reacted with a sharp movement, covering the papers with his palm. "Don't touch it, it's personal," he said in a harsher tone than he had ever allowed himself to communicate with her. Megan pulled her hand away and felt her heart clench inside her. Luke had never spoken to her so coldly before. A twinge of pain appeared in his chest. Maybe he didn't trust her, or was there something illegal there? But she decided not to raise a scandal. She just silently pursed her lips and sat down on the edge of the sofa. Luke noticed the change in her mood and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Sorry, There are a lot of difficulties here. This is a business that is now hanging by a thread, and any leaks or misunderstandings could be very costly." "I wasn't going to read anything," she said quietly, lowering her eyes. "I just wanted to help." He took a deep breath and sat down next to her. "I know. Sorry, I lost my temper. I'm just in a difficult position right now." Megan carefully intertwined her fingers with his, trying to regain familiar closeness. "Tell me a little. Maybe I can help with something." Luke was silent for a long time, as if he was trying to decide whether to share what he was hiding from her. Then he reluctantly replied, "I need to invest in a project that promises great benefits, but this requires serious money, which I don't have right now, and if I don't find them soon, I'll lose everything I've ever strived for." His voice sounded gloomy, and hidden anxiety flickered in his eyes. Megan felt her desire to help her loved one conflict with her fear of what she might be drawn into. "Luke," she began carefully, "why don't you take out a bank loan or look for partners?" "I'm looking," he answered tiredly, reached for a glass of wine and took a long sip. "But I need guarantees, and the bank does not yet believe in the quick payback of the project. And I don't have a perfect credit history after a bad deal a couple of years ago." He ran his hand through his hair, as if he wanted to wipe away the accumulated tension. "So I'm trying to collect the amount from different sources. But to be honest," he looked away for a moment, "I thought you could help me. I know that you and your husband have joint savings. You once said that Jason invested a large sum in stocks, right?" These words sounded like a bolt from the blue to Megan. She froze, trying to figure out if she had heard correctly. "Wait, are you serious?" she asked slowly. "You want me to ask Jason for money?" Luke shrugged as if it was no big deal. "Well, not necessarily directly from him. Maybe you yourself can somehow gain access to this amount, and then you will return everything when the project takes off." Megan's insides went cold. She suddenly realized that there was a certain calculation flashing in Luke's eyes. She understood that she couldn't just take family money and give it to her lover. The very thought of this seemed to her extremely dangerous, wrong, and even humiliating. Humiliating for everyone. For her, for Jason, and, of course, for their unstable relationship with Luke. "I can't do that," she replied, visibly nervous. "These are not my personal funds. We keep this money together, planning for the future, and Jason." Megan didn't finish, realizing how crazy it all sounds. She's sitting and discussing the theft of family money with the man with whom she's cheating on her own husband. Luke frowned and moved away. "Don't you trust me? I'll return them when things get better. Don't you want me to get up?" His voice sounded offended, even with a hint of reproach. She shook her head, feeling fear rising within her. "Of course I want to, but I cannot take this money from my husband. This is some kind of crime. But it's not a crime to deceive him every day by sleeping with me, right?" Luke burst out as if by chance, but behind the words there was a sharp, almost merciless logic. Megan felt her face flush with shame. He hit her where it hurt the most, because she had long been tormented by feelings of guilt. And now this proposal to steal the money that she and Jason managed together. "Luke, this is different," she whispered. I can't." He turned his gaze to the window, beyond which he could see the dim lights of suburban streets. "Megan," he said, trying to speak softly, "I don't want to put pressure on you. But understand, without money, I will lose the project. Maybe this will affect you and me too, because I will not be able to provide not only for myself, but also for our future. We wanted to be together, didn't we?" Megan didn't know what to answer. She was seized with panic from a sudden understanding. Luke was demanding the impossible from her, and at the same time, she feels that she is ready to take any risk in order not to lose his love, even if this love already seems bitter and ambiguous to her. The next day, she came home with a heavy heart. Jason was sitting in the kitchen, deep in work on his laptop. Seeing his wife, he became distracted and offered her tea. He looked calm, but when Megan sat down at the table, she noticed traces of fatigue and anxiety in his gaze. "How are you?" he asked, trying to smile. "Okay," Megan replied, lowering her eyes. She wanted to apologize for everything, tell the truth, and beg him to save her from herself. But she only remained silent, feeling that she was so deeply bogged down in her own lies that there was no way back in sight. At night, when Jason fell asleep, Megan quietly left the bedroom and headed into the living room. There, in a dark corner, among papers and documents, lay a thin folder with all their general financial investments and reports. Once upon a time, they were going to buy a bigger house together and open their own business. Now all those dreams were in jeopardy because of her. She opened the folder, looked at the numbers, and felt her heart skip a beat. There was a significant amount in the account, which could well be enough to help Luke out. But the thought of how she would take this money without telling her husband about it seemed to her not only crazy, but also immoral to the core. Still, Luke's voice echoed in my head. "Isn't it a crime to deceive him by sleeping with me?" Perhaps he was right. When she crossed that line of betrayal, each subsequent moral boundary was erased more easily. Anxiety and fear mixed in her with despair and a desire to save this relationship, even if it now seemed saturated with lies and self-interest. Over the next few days, Megan stopped sleeping and eating peacefully. She felt panic arising inside her. Luke began to talk more and more often about money, calling her with hope in his voice and persuading her that this was a temporary measure. At the same time, she increasingly saw the coldness in his eyes, a certain hidden demand that turned into irritation when she evaded a direct answer. One night she couldn't stand it and decided to talk to him directly. If he really loves her, let him wait. Let him find another way out. They met in a car parked near a deserted square. Luke sat behind the wheel, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "I've already given my word to my partners," he said, trying not to look at Megan. "I need money next week." "Luke, I can't take that risk. This is Jason's money, our family savings. How will I live with this if—" She didn't finish, but Luke immediately cut her off. "You are already living with betrayal. Why does taking part of the common money seem worse to you? I'll return it. Give me time. What if the project doesn't work out? What then?" she asked, feeling her voice begin to tremble. "How do I explain to Jason that all our money is gone?" "The project will work out," Luke said confidently, but nervousness flashed in his eyes. "I cannot fail." Megan wanted to object, but suddenly realized that he was not listening to her arguments. His own goal, his business, his plans, that's what moved him now more than love. And at that moment, for the first time, the suspicion arose in her that perhaps all this time he was just looking for a way to use her weakness and feelings for his own purposes. When they parted that night, Luke did not receive an agreement for the money, but he did not hear a categorical refusal either. He kissed her goodbye, but in this kiss there was no former tenderness and passion, just impatience and irritation. Megan went home feeling that the relationship had entered a dangerous phase. She was increasingly afraid of losing him, but she could no longer stay with him in this format. Love mixed with despair and fear, and perhaps with insight. Luke turned out to be completely different from the person she once loved in her youth. The morning started with a phone call. Megan picked up the phone, expecting to hear Luke's anxious or oppressive voice, which would again demand a decision from her. but instead she heard restrained politeness. "Megan, hi. Sorry about yesterday. Maybe we can meet at the Silver Lake Inn. I, I want to discuss everything calmly." She nodded, although she understood that he could not see this gesture on the phone. A bitterness rose in my throat. The desire to discuss everything calmly had long ago grown into tense quarrels. And yet she went to this meeting, hoping to find at least some way out. At the hotel, he met her in the lobby, took her hand, and, smiling slightly, led her to the reserved room. However, as soon as the door closed, their gazes crossed, and a spark of old feelings, mixed with mutual reproaches, seemed to jump between them. The accumulated emotions burst out unexpectedly brightly. Another moment, and they were already clinging to each other in a desperate kiss, full of passion and pain. Megan felt the same destructive, merciless desire flare up inside her, which made her forget about everything. About guilt, about morality, about lies. They took off their outerwear and, almost without thinking, moved to the bed, where every second turned into a storm of feelings and emotions. Luke pressed her to him, kissed her, whispered words that were difficult to attribute to pure love. They were saturated with melancholy, greed, and passion that knew no limits. Megan understood that what was happening now went beyond ordinary betrayal. It was like a hurricane that swallowed them both, carrying them into the abyss from which there is no return. After the wave of passion receded, it was replaced by silence and hopelessness. They lay looking at the ceiling, each immersed in their own thoughts. Megan felt a pulsation in her temples, and her heart was pounding as if it was going to jump out of her chest. "I don't know what will happen to us," she finally said, looking to the side. "Every time I promise myself that it's time to finish everything, but I can't." Luke sighed heavily, propped himself up on his elbow, and ran his hand through her disheveled hair. "I can't live without you either," he said quietly. "But damn, Megan, I'm in a serious hole. If I don't resolve my affairs, everything will collapse. I will lose my business, I will lose confidence in the future. And then how can I provide the life you deserve?" She turned away, realizing that they were talking about money again. Everything inside was shrinking. Yes, she loved Luke, but it was a love that had become painful and bitter, like some kind of poison that she can't stop drinking, even knowing that it's killing her. "And what do you want from me?" she asked, trying to speak calmly, but her voice trembled. "I want you to trust me," he answered, stroking her shoulder. "This money is just a temporary tool. Together, we will raise the project, pay for everything, and then we will be able to live the way we dreamed." Megan remembered the words, "We can live the life we dreamed of," and smiled bitterly to herself. In their youth, they dreamed of simple family happiness, of mutual support, of travel, of how he would build bridges, and she would write vivid reports. Now Luke dreamed of financial independence, which he hoped to obtain by actually deceiving her trust in her husband and stealing family capital. "I can't," she said, turning away from under his palm and sitting on the edge of the bed. "I can't steal from him. This is too much?" Luke asked with obvious irritation. "Isn't what we are doing beyond what is permitted? And if you're going all in, why not finish the job?" "We go all in for our feelings," she retorted, trying to find an argument that would distinguish the moral choice to leave money with her husband from physical infidelity. "And you want to use me in your business schemes. These are different things." Luke jumped up abruptly, began to get dressed, and, looking at her, blurted out, "So, our feelings are important to you, but my future, my life is not. You know that I love you, but without funds, I will have to give up everything and leave. Will you then disappear from my life too?" The words "leave" hit Megan harder than she expected. The fear of losing Luke, despite the ambiguity of their situation, was strong. She felt panic growing inside her. After all, deep down in her soul, she understood that she had become dependent on his passion, his kisses, his hugs. Without him, it's as if she will return to her boring reality, which now seems unbearably dreary to her. "Don't blackmail me," she said quietly, without turning around. "I'm not blackmailing. I tell it like it is," Luke replied, softening. He walked up to her and pressed his hand to her cheek. "I don't want to leave. I don't want to lose you again. but life forces. Understand, honey, this doesn't mean I'm using you. I want us to become partners in every sense. Didn't you dream that we would be together against the whole world? The quiet words cut to the heart. Megan closed her eyes, feeling tears burning her eyelids. Yes, she once imagined their couple as a union of two daring lovers, ready to do anything for love. But I didn't expect that it would all be so dirty and painful. Now both her past and her present seemed drawn into a quagmire of lies and despair. "Let me think," she whispered. "I can't make a rash decision rashly." Luke nodded and kissed her temple. "Okay, but hurry up. I don't have much time." Megan returned home to find Jason in the living room looking at old family photo albums. One of the photos showed their happy faces. It was their joint vacation several years ago, when they still lived in harmony. She sat down next to her, and he turned and looked at her with a strange, sad look. "I miss those times when we were simpler and more honest with each other," he said quietly. "I don't know what came between us, but it hurts me to realize that I'm losing you." Her husband's words painfully stung her already tormented soul. She wanted to say, "I ruined everything, I'm sorry," but instead she silently lowered her eyes. Her soul screamed that she was a traitor, destroying a kind and decent man with whom she had walked a long journey for years. That night she couldn't sleep again. Her mind, driven into a corner, tried to find a way out. If she gave Luke money, she would rob her husband. If she doesn't give it, Luke can leave, and with him those feelings that, as it seemed to her, are the only thing that now keeps her afloat will disappear. In the end, both the first and second options were terrifying. But the passion she felt for Luke was so strong that it seemed to overcome all principles and fears. The next day, she decided to meet him again. The meeting took place on the embankment, where they once confessed their eternal love to each other in their youth. Now only shadows of anxiety and hopelessness were reflected on their faces. Luke looked at her, seeing hesitation in her every move. "I agree," Megan finally said so quietly that the words barely left her lips. "But please be careful and keep me posted. I don't want to commit a crime against Jason, but I can't lose you again." A smile of such relief broke out on Luke's face that Megan felt for a split second that she had done something good after all. He pulled her to him and kissed her on the lips. "I knew you wouldn't leave me. Thank you." But soon she became afraid. It was all too easy a thank you for such a huge risk. She understood that she was entering a dangerous zone, where lies and self-destruction would become her constant companions. Their passion has gone so far that it has already grown into a real obsession, sick and exhausting. Megan no longer recognizes herself. Until recently, she was a loving wife, albeit with some doubts, and now she has become an accomplice in a possible fraud against her own husband. In the evening, Megan, almost without realizing it, crept into Jason's office and, holding her breath, opened the safe, the key to which her husband himself had once given her. There were documents confirming the rights to their joint account. The amount was impressive. When she took the documents in her hands, her fingers trembled. This was the very step that made her a criminal in her own eyes. Nausea rose in her throat from the realization of her own fall, but she could not take a step back. Passion for Luke, fear of losing him, desire to preserve everything that was left of her broken youth, all these overpowered moral prohibitions. The next day, she gave Luke the necessary papers, and he, without wasting any time, completed everything in the required manner. Then they met at his place, where he hugged her tightly with words of gratitude. But even then in his eyes, she saw not the old thrill of falling in love, but the predatory spark of a man who got what he wanted. Their passion overwhelmed them again, but now it was filled with the bitterness of the understanding that all limits and taboos had been completely erased. Megan screamed in her soul for help, but no one heard this silent cry. Each meeting became more intense and painful. They could not get enough of each other, but the more they burned in the embrace of passion, the more they suffered from their own immorality and lies. Megan was literally torn between two men and between her two inner voices, one screaming at her that this was all wrong, the other whispering that this was how she felt alive. And in the depths of her consciousness, an understanding was already mature. Nothing good would come from this story. Collapse was inevitable, and yet she couldn't stop. Like a moth that flies to the flame of a candle, Megan returned to Luke again and again, each time losing a piece of herself and plunging into a deeper and deeper shadow. A destructive passion enveloped her soul, leaving no way to retreat. She didn't know how much longer she could live in this state. The world around her began to lose color. Every day she woke up in pain and fell asleep in tears. Yes, Luke was nearby, but their relationship was less and less reminiscent of the bright feeling that connected them in their youth. Now it was a tangle of lies, fear, and uncontrollable desire that could not be satisfied, but only flared up brighter, burning both her and the remnants of her past. Megan soon noticed that even the sight of her own reflection in the mirror disgusted her. Bruises under the eyes, a haggard face, nervous breakdowns, all this became a constant attribute of her days. Not a trace remained of the former self-confident woman. But the worst thing was that she no longer knew how to get herself back. Breaking off the relationship with Luke seemed unthinkable to her, and living a lie with Jason seemed even more unbearable. This would have continued for some time if events had not begun to develop rapidly. The money Megan gave to Luke has disappeared from the account. Jason began to doubt and check the balance, suspecting that there was some kind of error or glitch in the system. Megan saw him on the phone with the bank every day, angrily discussing where the large sum had gone. With every minute her fear grew, and her passion for Luke turned into a stone around her neck. From the moment Jason had the first suspicion that something was wrong with his wife, he did not stop quietly but persistently observing. He was not ready for drastic actions or loud scandals because he still loved Megan and hoped that everything would somehow work out. But alas, events developed in such a way that he could no longer continue to live in ignorance. First, Jason noticed that some of their joint money had disappeared from the account. The amount was significant, and he decided that it was some kind of technical error at the bank or a glitch in the system. However, calls to the bank, repeated checks, and examination of statements showed that the transfer was made deliberately, and with the consent of Megan as the second owner of the account. He didn't believe his eyes, but calmly collected all the documents and put them aside until clarification. He understood that the conversation would be difficult, and he wanted to be 100% sure that he was not mistaken. The next alarm bell was the phone calls and messages that Megan began to receive in the evenings. She hit her phone more and more, quickly turned off the sound when her husband came in, and flinched nervously if the gadget began to vibrate. One day, returning from work a little earlier than planned, Jason caught her just as she was hastily locking the screen. She smiled nervously, muttered something about friend, and immediately went into another room. It was then that he felt his worst fears might be true. In the end, chance helped him discover what he was so afraid of. One night, she forgot her phone on the kitchen table. Jason saw the screen flash. "Luke," the notification said. Remembering that this particular person was mentioned earlier in strange bank documents, the husband could not resist the temptation to see what was happening there. Perhaps he did not want to break personal boundaries, but events had gone too far, and pain and anxiety were pulling him deeper. Scrolling through the latest messages, he realized everything is much more serious than just friendly meetings. There were fragments of correspondence about the project, funds, investments, and most painfully about feelings that he and his wife, it turns out, openly discussed. His heart sank and his hand shook. Jason was shocked that Megan was not only cheating on him physically, but also seemed to be helping Luke get their hands on their shared savings. He reread it several times, not believing his own eyes. A direct mention of amounts, account information, and promises to return everything with interest. Instead of immediately causing a scandal, Jason just carefully put the phone back where it was and went into the bedroom. He spent the whole night awake, staring at the ceiling with an empty head and a heavy heart. He understood that his marriage was destroyed and the trust he had in Megan was irretrievably lost. The next morning, she noticed that Jason was acting distant, but he stubbornly did not say what was wrong and did not make any accusations. On the one hand, this alarmed her. On the other hand, she could not say, "I know that you read my messages." After all, then you will have to admit everything. Therefore, they walked around each other as if through a minefield. Short phrases, uncertain gestures, and ever-increasing tension. Meanwhile, Jason gradually developed his plan. He didn't want to get divorced rashly or cause a noisy scene in which everyone would suffer even more. First of all, he wanted to understand how far their betrayal went. After all, it was obvious that we were talking not only about betrayal, but also about strange financial schemes into which Megan was drawn. He suspected that Luke might be a fraud, but without more accurate information, I didn't want to make any sudden movements. Megan felt that the situation had gone further than she could control. On the one hand, her husband, who suddenly became quiet, but at the same time carefully watched her every move. On the other hand, there is Luke, turning from an affectionate lover into a man who demands more and more investments and reproaches her for slowness. Sometimes, looking at him, she remembered her youth and that reverent love that seemed naive but pure to her. Now this feeling was mixed with a bitter mixture of passion and the realization that she was perhaps just a convenient tool in his hands. For several days, Megan tried to improve her relationship with her husband. She managed to cook dinner, come up with little joint plans for the evening, but every time she came across an invisible wall that Jason built around himself. Sometimes it seemed to her that just a little more and everything would return as it was before, but the next moment she caught his gaze on her, and everything inside her shrank with fear. She guessed that he knew something, but could not bring herself to ask directly. Luke continued to call her, write messages, and insist on meetings. Each time he said more and more alarming phrases. There will be a check soon. I urgently need your transfer to the letter of credit. Megan, we are wasting time. All this talk about money began to disgust her. After all, she hoped that their relationship was based on love and not on financial calculations. But she clung to his words about our future, although she no longer believed in them as sincerely as before. When she did meet with Luke, passion still burned in their kisses and touches, but too often she was interrupted by conversations about projects, schemes, and bank documents. This game on two fronts exhausted Megan so much that sometimes she could not sleep until the morning. Lying next to her husband, she thought, why did I start all this? It would be better if I remained in a quiet, albeit routine, family life. One day, after another meeting with Luke, she returned home and found Jason in front of her laptop. He raised his eyes and said coldly, I was waiting for you earlier. You're late. Yes, I went shopping, she lied, picking up a bag from the store. There was almost nothing inside, except for one chocolate bar. But she didn't have the strength to think of a more convincing cover. Jason looked at her as if he wanted to ask something else, but said nothing, just nodded. This silent reproach was heavier than any accusation. Megan went to the bathroom, looking at her reflection. Circles under the eyes, pursed lips, a face without a hint of its former blush. It seemed that she was aging before her eyes, losing herself in these endless lying games. But the most dangerous was the next meeting with Luke. They were sitting in a car near his office, and he, usually reserved after the warmth of a hug, behaved fiercely. Megan, I had to borrow from one person of interest, a very large sum. If I don't cover at least part of the debt soon, there will be big trouble, and for me, and perhaps for you. She looked at him with horror. What do I have to do with it? Why do you keep getting into debt? We already have enough problems. I can't keep transferring money to you forever. The bill is not bottomless, and Jason will notice everything if he hasn't already. Well, so what? He'll notice, Luke interrupted, nervously tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. Let him notice. You're either with me or you're not. Decide quickly. I can't risk it. If you don't help, I could lose everything, and then we'll both be lost. The words, we'll both be lost, sounded like a threat, although Megan wasn't sure if he himself was aware of the reaction he was causing. It seemed to her that the love she considered reborn had long ago turned into a mechanism of blackmail and manipulation. She wanted to scream, punch the steering wheel, run away, but she just sat there, clutching her seat belt, as if it could protect her from this destructive force. I can't do this anymore, she whispered almost silently. This is killing me. Me too, Luke muttered, but there are no options. Choose money or the end. She looked up at him. There were tears in them. If they had ever told her that their beautiful love story would turn into this nightmare, she would have laughed and not believed it. But now all they had was despair and fear. Megan still hoped that everything would somehow work out, but events began to develop rapidly. First, Jason detailed all the transactions on their joint account and discovered a whole chain of dubious transfers. Some amounts went to unknown details, and when he connected these transfers with documents that he had once seen on his wife's phone, he had no doubt that Megan was transferring the money to Luke. Based on cold calculation, he decided not to make a scene right away. He wanted to collect as much evidence as possible and understand what exactly this mysterious ex was up to. With all the evidence in his hands, Jason prepared for a decisive conversation. But suddenly events got ahead of him. The bank called him, informing him that the account was blocked due to suspicious activity and complaints received from one of the counterparties. His heart sank. It means that the problems have already spilled out, and now we are talking not only about their internal drama, but also about potential legal consequences. That same day, Megan hurriedly tried to call Luke to understand what was happening, but heard only short rings. Finally, he picked up the phone and spoke in a broken whisper. "Megan, we have a problem. My partners, it turned out that the project is not. I don't know where the bank got this information from, but I'm facing an investigation. Damn, I'm so screwed that—" He spoke confusedly, confused in his testimony. Megan listened to him in horror, not understanding what exactly the plan was. But she was convinced of one thing: the money he borrowed was actually burned in unsuccessful fraud, and now no one will return anything. "So you only used me as a source of money?" she asked, barely breathing. "No, no," Luke shouted. "I wanted to rise. I wanted to provide both of us with a decent future. Who knew things would turn out this way?" But Megan understood. Everything was unfolding according to the worst scenario. The financial collapse is already here, and the consequences will be a nightmare for everyone. She hung up, feeling her hands shaking from powerlessness and resentment. That same evening, Jason, returning home, walked into the living room where she was sitting with her head down. He stood in front of her and asked a question without preamble. "How long has this been going on?" Megan looked up at him with reddened eyes. It seemed to her that the ground was about to collapse under her feet. He handed her a folder with printouts of translations, photographs of documents, and screenshots of correspondence. All this, testifying to her double life, lay before her like a sentence. I'm sorry," was all Megan could say. "Did you really think that I wouldn't notice?" he asked bitterly. "For a long time I hoped that I was wrong, that all this was some kind of nonsense. But no, everything turned out to be true." She tried to explain something, to justify herself. At first it was just feelings, then Luke assured her that he would return the money, and that she herself did not know how to decide to refuse. But every phrase she said sounded pitiful and unconvincing. Jason listened silently, desperate pain and disappointment visible in his eyes. "You know," he said at the end, clutching the folder, "I would be ready to forgive even betrayal. People are weak and make mistakes, but the fact that you dragged our common money into someone's dark scheme is beyond the bounds. This is a blow to everything we have built. Believe me, I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, jumping up and trying to touch his hand. "I myself didn't expect that it would go so far. That's enough," Jason cut her off. "I want you to understand. There are things that cannot be forgotten, even if you love a person very much. I don't know how we will live further. We may have to." He didn't finish, but Megan could see the word divorce on the tip of his tongue. He didn't make accusations or shout. He simply walked up to the door and, looking back, quietly said, "Now the lawyers will take care of this matter, and we will talk to you when I decide that I have enough strength to bear your explanations." After that, he left, leaving Megan alone with the bitter truth. Her love for Luke resulted in a double betrayal and led to financial ruin, for which everyone will have to pay. She chose a crowded cafe in the city center, where, according to her calculations, no one could cause a scandal or try to force her to do something under the threat of physical harm. Luke agreed to the meeting reluctantly, but his voice no longer contained the former passionate softness. Instead, notes of hidden aggression and distrust were heard. Megan sensed that he had formed a plan, and she was afraid that it could be disastrous for her. Before leaving the house, she nervously paced the hallway, trying to control the trembling in her hands. Her life had already been filled with stress for several months. Scandals with her husband, a financial hole, threats and showdowns. And now, when Megan internally prepared for the decisive conversation, the feeling grew inside her that she was going to the battlefield without weapons. But she had no choice. She needed to close this chapter once and for all before the situation completely consumed her. When Megan arrived, Luke was already sitting by the window, nervously shifting in his chair and tapping his fingers on the table. He met her with a cold gaze that showed irritation. There is almost nothing left of the man she once loved in her youth. "I hope you have specific reasons for calling me here," he said dryly as Megan sat down opposite. She took a deep breath, trying not to show the fear that gripped her. A voice that sounded loudly in my head repeated, "Don't be afraid. You have nothing left to lose. You decided to free yourself." "Luke," she began firmly, "I can't date you anymore. Everything between us went too far. Our relationship has ruined my life, and I don't want to continue it. I'm leaving." She saw Luke's eyes narrow and his lips pressed into a tight line. It seemed that he was trying to understand how serious her intentions were and whether there was a loophole for compromise in them. "Are you leaving?" he asked with a grin that made her squirm inside. "I wonder what has changed. Or maybe you just have a new sponsor. Or has your husband decided to forgive you?" "It doesn't matter," she replied, trying to speak evenly. "I understand that I did wrong, but I am ready to take responsibility for it. I just beg you, leave me alone." He leaned forward, and Megan felt the tension emanating from him. Perhaps it was anger, or perhaps despair. "You forget that, unlike you, I was left without funds. My business is going downhill, and you promised to help. And more than once." "It wasn't my money," she exclaimed a little louder than she intended. "I stole them from my husband under your pressure, and now I'm left with nothing. I had to go through humiliation, divorce, and hatred from loved ones. You ask for help, but how else can I help you? I have nothing left." Luke listened to her tirade with a grim expression, then nodded as if taking note of her despair. But the next second he spoke more quietly, in a low and almost hissing voice. "If you think you can leave like this, you are very mistaken. You know, I have a couple of documents. You signed them yourself. I wouldn't be surprised if the police are interested in them. And then you will not only find yourself without funds, but also face charges for fraud." Megan went cold. She did sign some things to certify the transfers, but she didn't realize the full implications. It seemed to her that it would be easier to withdraw money for Luke, and now these papers could turn against her. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, feeling tears threatening to break through. "Because I'm not going to drown alone," Luke said, straightening up and leaning back in his chair. "Either you stay with me, helping me when I need it, or we both go to the bottom. Think about it." Megan froze, realizing that she was trapped. Her desire to free herself from this relationship ran into threats and blackmail against which she felt defenseless. An attempt to break the connection almost turned into a scandal right in the cafe. Luke stood up without waiting for an answer, threw a few bills on the table for his coffee, and leaned over her, saying goodbye. "You have time to think, honey." But not for long. He turned around and walked out of the cafe, leaving Megan in a state of shock. It suddenly seemed to her that the air around her had thickened, and the noise of the visitors had become unbearably loud. The pulse beat in his temples, and cold sweat appeared on his forehead. She understood that this time the breakup could cost her her freedom, and that there was almost no way out of the situation in sight. Since then, she avoided Luke's calls, didn't respond to messages, and tried to isolate herself from him as much as possible. But what was done earlier now turns against her. documents, translations, all this can be interpreted in favor of the fact that Megan was the organizer of the fraud. Her mental state worsened every day. She spent the night with a friend because returning to the empty apartment she once shared with her husband was unbearable. There, she recalled too clearly the days when she was still a full-fledged wife and not a criminal or a hostage to her former lover. Fear settled inside her. She didn't know what to do or who to turn to. After all, confessing to the police means admitting your own guilt. Asking your husband for help means finally admitting to all the betrayals and even putting additional problems on him. But Megan felt that everything was coming to the point of no return, and if she didn't find a way out, Luke would completely drag her down. While Megan continued to flounder in desperate attempts to break up with Luke, Jason, her legal husband, went his own way. After weighing all the evidence and consulting with a lawyer, he finally decided to divorce. The decision was not easy for him, because despite the pain and resentment, he was still inclined to remember happy moments when they were a young couple in love, with plans for children and family. But betrayal, deception, and financial fraud turned out to be too serious a blow to his trust. Preparing for a divorce turned out to be a difficult task. It was necessary to divide property, decide who would get the apartment, and resolve the financial obligations in which they found themselves thanks to Megan's machinations. Jason's lawyer insisted on the toughest possible approach to protect the client and achieve compensation for the stolen money. But Jason, to the surprise of his lawyer, showed unexpected gentleness. "I don't want to deprive her of everything," he said in response to advice to sue her for fraud. "Yes, she acted meanly, she betrayed me. But I remember who she used to be. Maybe at some point she broke down and fell under the influence of this person. I don't want to finish her off completely, because she is also a human being. We all need chances sometimes." The lawyer, accustomed to complex cases, only raised an eyebrow skeptically, but followed the client's instructions. As a result, a package of documents was prepared, which spelled out the conditions. Jason keeps the apartment for himself, but is ready to compensate Megan for part of her share so that she can start a new life. At the same time, he refused to file a criminal complaint if she voluntarily signed all the papers and confirmed that she would no longer lay claim to any joint assets. When the day arrived, Megan was called into the law office. Knowing that the decisive step was coming, she came with trembling knees. Sitting opposite her husband in the lawyer's office, she could not raise her eyes to him, but he behaved calmly, although rather coldly. "Here are all the conditions," said the lawyer, handing her a folder. "Your spouse is ready to leave you a certain amount of funds in your personal account. However, you waive any claims to the property and also confirm that you will not participate in further legal proceedings regarding financial fraud." Megan nodded, realizing that she had no other choice. And at the same time, deep down, she felt waves of gratitude towards Jason for his humanity. He could have chosen a harsher scenario, bringing her under criminal charges, but he decided to preserve the opportunity for her to start over. She took the pen and slowly signed, feeling like at that very moment her life with him was officially ending. After signing the papers, Jason and Megan went outside. A light rain was falling, and the windows of the office building reflected the gray sky. He wanted to leave, but her gaze stopped him for a moment. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I know this won't make up for what I did. But I'm very sorry that it ended like this." Jason looked into her reddened eyes. There was no longer any warmth left in his gaze, but he seemed to have found the strength to refrain from harsh words. "Take care of yourself," he said restrainedly. "Maybe someday you'll have a chance to make things right. Not with me, but with your life." He turned and walked away, leaving Megan with a strange feeling of emptiness. The divorce, which she was terribly afraid of, to some extent even brought her relief. Now she did not deceive her husband and did not drag him into the abyss with her. But another problem lay ahead: Luke and his threats, as well as her own conscience, which did not give her peace day or night. When the divorce formalities were settled and Megan's life finally took a new path, she felt as if she had been thrown into an unfamiliar city without a map or money. The former family, home, prosperity, everything is left behind. There were almost no savings left, and the reputation in the eyes of many people was ruined. She had to build a new life, and on the ruins of the old one. And most importantly, she needed to get rid of the noose that Luke had thrown around her neck. The first thing Megan decided to do was find a new job. Her former place in her husband's company was lost, and she could not remain there given the general scandal and the feeling that everyone looked at her as a traitor. She sent out resumes wherever she could, but often found that real jobs required recommendations and a good reputation. In some cases, she was rejected immediately after the initial interview, as soon as rumors leaked about her problematic relationships and dubious financial transactions. However, luck smiled on her when a charity organization invited her for an interview. They needed a specialist who could carry out administrative activities, prepare reports, work with documents, and organize various charitable events. Perhaps the head of the foundation didn't care that Megan might once have been wrong. That woman believed in second chances, and therefore was ready to give her the opportunity to prove herself. For Megan, this was the first step towards redemption. Every day, coming to the small office of the foundation, she tried to show that she was capable of something good, that she could be honest, responsible, and careful in her work. She worked overtime, took on any task, no matter how pleasant it was, trying to earn the trust and respect of her new colleagues. However, the main fear remained Luke. He still wrote to her, threatening to out her scheme to the police if she didn't continue to help him. The first weeks after the divorce, Megan was literally shaking from every call. But little by little, she began to understand that he no longer had serious leverage. Their joint account was devastated, and she had actually already suffered punishment in the form of the collapse of her marriage and reputation. If Luke had gone to the police, he would have set himself up, because his role in the fraud is much more significant. Gradually, he began to bother her less often, and the threats faded into general terms. Obviously, he himself had suffered greatly from his own affairs and now did not risk making noise. Through the efforts of Megan's lawyers, they managed to cancel some of the documents that she signed under pressure. The law is not always simple, but she was helped by persistence, as well as the unspoken support of Jason, who did not want to finish off his ex-wife through criminal authorities. As a result, Luke lost his trump card and was forced to leave Megan alone. There were rumors that he had moved to another state or even another country in an attempt to escape persecution. Megan decided not to find out the details. She just thanked fate for the fact that this head of her life seemed to have finally slammed shut. While working for a charity, Megan came across different people whose lives were full of tragedy and loss. Some were suffering from serious illness, some were left homeless and without money, and some were struggling with their own demons, similar to her own. Communicating with those who really needed help, she realized that her own troubles were important, but not the only blow of fate. There are people who have it much harder and who do not lose hope. By watching small steps and real actions help others, Megan learned to overcome her own feelings of guilt. She took upon herself the organization of charity events, went out into the streets with volunteers, collected donations, and looked for sponsors. At first, she was torn by the thought that perhaps she was just trying to make amends for herself, but later she realized that even if this was the case, the work brings real benefits to people. At one of the events that the foundation held for children from disadvantaged families, Megan felt pure joy for the first time in a long time. She saw kids laughing while participating in competitions and parents thanking the organization for the opportunity to forget about their problems for at least a day. It was then that she realized that she had found a purpose for which she wanted to live to help others and at the same time restore faith in herself. Over time, Megan acquired a small rented apartment. Even though it was a modest home, far from her former comforts, she felt that this was her own space, where there were no shadows of the past. She gradually began to communicate with new people, colleagues at the foundation, old friends who were ready to accept her even after everything that had happened. In the process of conversations with a psychologist who was recommended to her by the head of the foundation, Megan pieced together her motivation to embark on the path of deception and betrayal. I realized that her dissatisfaction, A feeling of unexpressed protest and longing for youthful passion pushed her to search for something forbidden, and financial temptations became only an additional factor that turned into a disaster. She admitted to herself that she realized too late the value of normal, simple feelings such as she had at the beginning of her marriage. But bitter experience has shown that time cannot be turned back. All that remains is to realize the lessons and move on. One day, while sorting out the remains of things that she had taken from the old house, Megan came across photographs of her and Jason. In one of them, they smiled at each other, standing at the foot of the mountain slope where they once spent their vacation. She held her gaze on this happy moment, feeling a sharp pang of nostalgia. But this time, instead of tears, I felt quiet, calm regret and gratitude. Thank you that they once had love, and that it lasted long enough to leave fond memories. She put the photo in a box, deciding that she was not yet ready to get rid of it completely. It was still part of her life. But she didn't put it in a prominent place either. The past needs to be left behind and not kept before your eyes. At that moment, Megan caught herself thinking that she finally felt freedom from the internal drama that was tearing her apart. She no longer needs to deceive herself, seek forbidden meetings, or fear threats. She can breathe deeply and make plans for the future, guided by other life experiences. At work at the charity foundation, she was increasingly told words of gratitude. "You are doing a very important job, Megan. Thank you for helping organize so much help for families. We appreciate your contribution, your efforts." From these words, a sense of self-worth blossomed in her, but not the arrogant pride that before. It was important to her that she was truly useful and not looking for benefits or short-term emotional satisfaction. In her personal life, she has so far avoided serious relationships. After a painful lesson, I needed a break to learn to live in harmony with myself. But friends and girlfriends appeared, joint trips to the cinema, to the mountains, new hobbies. Megan tried yoga, started jogging in the morning, started reading self-development books, and even enrolled in an art design course. She wanted to fill all the gaps in her life that she had previously filled either with everyday worries or with crazy passion with Luke. A year after the divorce, Megan took a short vacation and decided to go to the ocean alone. It always seemed to her that it was symbolic, to go to where endless waves wash away footprints in the sand, as if repeating that everything can be started anew. Breathing in the salty air, she felt the voices of the past fade away inside. Now it is not bitter regret, but rather conscious acceptance. Megan took a notebook with her to write about what she felt, and it turned out to be a whole journal of reflections on life, mistakes, and forgiveness, most of all, herself. She thought about those in her past, including Jason. Would she like to ask him for forgiveness in person? Yes, but she understood that they were both not ready and perhaps did not need to resume contact. And Luke, his memory no longer evoked such a strong response. This was a dangerous part of her journey that left deep scars. Returning from vacation, Megan felt calmer and more confident on her feet. She was no longer haunted by nightmares about uncovered frauds and frightening threats. She learned to live with the understanding that you always have to pay for mistakes, but any person is capable of changing for the better if he sincerely wants to. When asked what is important to her in life now, Megan answered, "Be helpful and honest with others and with yourself." This is how the final stage of the story's closure came. She regained control over her own destiny, realized that no one else would determine her value and make her feel happiness except herself. And let this happiness now be based not on a storm of passions and not on a luxurious lifestyle, but on a quiet, moderate joy from everyday lived, from the opportunity to help people, from a peaceful sleep without the fear of exposure. A few years ago, she might have considered such a life boring. Now Megan was grateful for the calm and stability that she had worked so hard to build. The main lesson she learned is the ability to appreciate what is, without giving up everything for the sake of illusory illusions. Having learned to understand herself and her true desires, she was no longer afraid of loneliness and knew that if one day a new love came into her life, it would be a different, more mature experience without deception and fear. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.